And that was very hard for my mum, because she lost not only her mother, but she soon after having me, lost her husband. The war came in, and it was very, very trying for her. You see, the women, married women, weren't expected to work. You couldn't employ, I probably told you this before, you couldn't employ married women. Married women, their place was in the home. And so employers didn't interest themselves in married women because they weren't entitled to employ them because of their status as married women. They're only interested in single women as employers. So it was a very, very tricky time. And then when you get the combination of the war, the predicament for married women without a husband, without anybody being able to look after them, was dire. There's no provision, financial provisions from the state. And my father had only been, because he died when he was 38, and hadn't got enough stamps he paid into on his tax or what he'd earned. So there was no money to my mother to get for a widow's pension, because whilst she was a widow, there wasn't enough stamps. He hadn't been dead sufficiently long, so she missed out on that. And then when the war comes, 1939, and she was totally washed up. And as I probably said, or will say in here, I probably had the best godmother that you could imagine. Because my mum's best friend, who was a spinster, really befriended my mother like a sister, really. And though my mother had a sister, she was married with 2 or 3 children, we had 4 together, and they lived quite a long way down in Sidcup, and she got more than enough on her plate to concern herself with her husband and her growing family. They lived quite a long way away. And so Evie Dent, my godmother, was wonderful. I even have to thank her for looking after me when I was leaving school. And so it came to 16, you got to leave. Well, at Reedham, you had to get out. No staying on to 18 to do, more exams. And so when she knew that I was having to get ready to leave school, she then took an interest in me and said, well, you're going to have to get a job, aren't you? Sort of thing. How are you going to go about it? Well, there was no provision at the school at Reedham to assist you in getting a job. When the time came down, you were 16, you were out. You haven't got a job, well, that's too bad. But she was very kind, and she knew my interest in mapping. Have I told you this? She knew my interest in maps and things. I used to like maps. And we discussed, she said, what are you going to do, and what would you like to do, and discuss that. And she said, oh, well, I'll look out see what jobs are around. And she used to take the evening news, I think. And she found this job being advertised in the evening news. This is for a junior assistant in the planning department at Middlesex. So she sent this through to me. She says, I think this might interest you. So I looked at this and I thought, oh yeah, this sounds quite interesting, in the planning department, because this was all new. Town planning was a brand new subject, and they were, in 1950, they were starting to form these new planning departments. And so I duly applied, and I remember very clearly applying, and I thought, I'll just write them a letter. That won't cut much ice. I've got to sort of get them to look at my application in a bit more depth than just a letter. So I thought, what can I do? So I then set about showing them that I was able to produce an enlargement of a map, you see, because something we learnt at school, that you see, you've got a map, you want to enlarge the scale of it. There's a system where you can do it. It's not that difficult, but it's sort of one of the fundamentals that you would have up your sleeve if you were in the business of working on maps. So I did this, and I reproduced the map at a larger scale and sent it through to them. And kind of long story short, got the job, which is absolutely marvellous. But she was the driving force for me. Yeah. My mother was obviously brought up with her father in the greengrocery business, so you couldn't describe her as a businesswoman. Whereas my godmother, being a spinster, not having been married, had worked the whole of her life, and she worked for the whole of her life in W.H. Smith's. And that's where the connection with W.H. Smith came about. And then, latterly, it was possible for my mum to get a job at W.H. Smith's with the assistance of her good friend, Evie Dent. And so then my mum became a businesswoman, and in the final analysis, retired with a pension from W.H. Smith, which was rather good. But it comes back, you see, to Evie Dent. She was the driving force for her, and with my mum, me, to help us. So she was a star. So that's why we're talking about Evie. You're not recording this, are you? Oh dear. Well, I think I've gone off the straight and narrow, haven't I? What were we talking about before?
Whatever you like. Whatever you like.
Whatever you want.
Yeah, I want to go back to 1939. So, I went to Reedham, very hard. It was hard for everybody, you see, because the war had only just started in 1939, September 1939, which was the very month I went into Reedham. So, very, very tough time for everybody. Obviously, as time went on, the air raids became more frequent, and we then had to have a lot of time in the shelters. I mean, the theory was that we would be able to do studies, start classwork in the shelters, but in practice it was pretty hopeless, because they were completely underground, the shelters, and the sort of light we had was like emergency lighting, and so it was not something that had any great benefit to us. The important thing obviously was that we were all safe underground. But obviously we weren't in shelters all the time. and obviously there was things that we did. I remember that we did the good old basics, reading, writing and arithmetic. I found that I had a fairly good propensity for spelling and maths, and managed to keep my head above water in that regard. In some subjects, like maths, I used to do quite well. I also remember that there was a girl who, same class as me, used to do very well, and we found ourselves, you know, either first or second in the class on things like spelling and maths. But I said to myself, well, you can expect that she would do better than me sometimes, because she was actually a day girl. So while she was at Reedham, she was only at Reedham for the day classes, and wasn't a boarder as I was, and would have a parent at home, no doubt, to give us assistance, but never mind. I remember very clearly this day girl vying with me to get top spot in some of the subjects. But looking back over those years, one of the things that I think probably anybody of my age would recall was checking out the progress of the Allies in the war, and that the teachers would bring in cuttings from newspapers, and in the newspapers at the time there would be, as you would imagine, a huge amount of information as to the progress of the war, not always progress, and so learning about the war and all that went with it was almost another subject that we learned over and above the basics, maths and English and what have you. I suppose it was an extension of a geography lesson, but the war and the progress of it was certainly figured greatly in our day-to-day education. Otherwise, you know, I think that one just pressed on. I don't recall there being any great dramas with regard to examinations. Obviously we had class exams or class tests, and those seemed to go pretty well for me. I didn't sort of get any hang-ups about those situations. So, you know, Reedham was hard, but it was hard for everybody in those years. When the school holidays arrived, that's the conventional holidays of Christmas, Easter and the summer holiday, it was expected that the mothers or other family members would take care of the children during those holiday periods. But there were, of course, quite a number of boys and girls at Reedham who had nobody, and it was necessary for the Reedham authorities to try and find foster parents so that they could be looked after during the periods of the school holidays. To be fair, the school were pretty successful at that, and generally speaking, remembering the experiences of fellow boys and girls there, that those that did have some foster parents and went off to them for the school holidays pretty well had a very good experience. Didn't hear, I don't recall any situations where children had unhappy situations with foster parents. And so obviously that side worked out very well in practice. And I think I could think of some boys there who had foster parents, and for them they became quasi-parents. You know, they did very well indeed. But when you're on holiday like that, you know, you say, oh great, my mother's gone off to work, I'm on holiday, who's to know what I get up to? So there was a tremendous amount of freedom. But freedom's all right if you've got the wherewithal to enjoy it, like money. So we didn't have money. I mean, I used to get, as some of my fellow Reedham boys, get a bit of pocket money from your mother or or friends of the family and that sort of thing. But in wartime there wasn't too much money to slosh around, and you might pick up the odd 2 shilling or shilling from a friend of the family. But what that did was to enable us to perhaps afford a few bus fares, and with fellow parents doing the visiting, usually once a month, they would they would meet up with fellow parents, and so you have sort of almost parents groups, and they got together, and that enabled them to sort of say, well, you let your boy come over and he can stay with us, or we'll meet up, or we'll look after him. So there was this sort of growing friendship between the friends of the boys and girls who were at Reedham, and they used to meet up on visiting days, which was once a month, and compare notes and so on. And so as this went on, and we as children got a bit older and more mature, you built up relationships with these families, and to this day, as you may know, we have had a lifelong friendship with the Hord family, and also Derek Pierce, and so we both went through Reedham together, and ostensibly we're sort of like brothers, and it's fantastic. And so we owe lots to Reedham, including, even though we went to a charitable orphanage, we ended up with friends who was like brothers and sisters. So that was another aspect of forming relationships during the school holidays. Quite something. Yeah, holidays initially were difficult, but as you got older, holidays afforded you a bit of freedom so you could get out and visit places. I mean, one of the good things was, whilst we didn't have much pocket money, bus fares and things were very cheap indeed. And if I remember, you could travel quite a long way on a bus. And there would be special tickets between 10 o'clock in the morning and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, obviously off-peak. And so that for us lads, being able to take advantage of an off-peak ticket, say from 10 o'clock, we could travel very cheaply from North London, where we were at Highbury, and go down into central London, and we would meet up and things like that. And I mean, we didn't have much money, so it just meant wandering around looking. We hadn't got much money to spend, but actually we had enough money to be able to get around and see what was going on, and widen our horizons. And when you could do it with your friends, you know, that made it very, very happy. And also, of course, a vast improvement of being sort of locked away at Reedham. So holidays increasingly became a period of great pleasure. Its official title, I think, was Reedham Orphanage. set up as an orphanage, and formally changed its name to Reedham School, oddly enough, the very year I left in 1950. So I suppose formally I was at an orphanage for the totality of my period of education through to 1950. But whilst it was very tough being at Reedham, looking back, I have to be extremely grateful for so much. Firstly, the facility of actually getting a place at Reedham, and my mother, having lost my husband, her husband, in 1938, as it happened, got to know, obviously, from her new stepmother, her father's new wife, that there was a place called Reedham, because my step-grandmother had in fact sent one of her two children to Reedham. And so when my mother was in dire straits, she said, oh, well, perhaps you should try and get your son Brian into Reedham. And so because she knew all about Reedham, she was able to point the way to my mum to get a place into Reedham. And that meant generating support. You have to go around, write to different agencies and secure their help and say, this is me, and all these letters of support, presumably you got sufficient, went up to the head office, and they sifted all those out. And cut a long story short, my mother, was successful, and so I duly got a place at Reedham and started in September 1939. But that was quite a job for her, because obviously there would be quite a lot of competition, and some families obviously had more than one dependent to worry about. So that's how I got to Reedham. Well, I think for any parent, the first day of their child's starting at school is a very big day in their life. And looking back myself, I think the first day at school is a very big day in the life of the child concerned. I certainly remembered it well. And like probably a lot of families, it was built up as a big day in your life. You're off to school. Big school, you're off to big school. Wonderful. Well, my first day at big school started, so far as I can remember, on the platform of Eastcote Underground Station with my mother, and there was I on the platform that morning in September 1939. It's the 3rd of September, and waiting on the platform, regaled in my new bright gold blazer, and all the shoes and everything to go with it, with new tie and everything. Felt very, very smart. Say, oh, this is exciting. Going off to school on the trains. Didn't often go on trains, So we caught the underground there, and that was all fine. So then we found ourselves out of the underground into the big trains at London Bridge, and we then got the next train, which took us down to Reedham. And something which I look back on and think how important Reedham was, because not many places had their own station. Reedham had its own station. Well, it may not actually have had a station just for itself, but the station was called Reedham. And so when you get out of the station and it's Reedham's own station, you know, it makes you feel a little bit more important. This is important. And so, having got to Reedham, we then had to lug the case up the very steep hill, big steep hill from Reedham station, and we climbed this steep hill, and I remember we got about 3/4 of the way up, and there's a seat. Somebody had a lot of not only foresight but understanding about those, and most of us were in that capacity, of having to walk up the hill to get to the Reedham school buildings. And so I remember we sat, because we had our luggage with us, sat on the seat 3/4 of the way up the drive to Reedham, and you could see the view, and I remember, oh, isn't this wonderful? And the railway line is in fact the main line between London and Brighton, you see. And so lots of trains were going backwards and forwards, and at that time, because the war had hardly started, the Brighton Bell and all the Pullman trains were going backwards and forwards. And I thought, oh, this is wonderful, all these posh trains and everything. This was, you know, very interesting. So, finished resting, get our breath back to go for the last part up the hill. So we climb up the next bit. We come to this huge building, grey slate looking building in stone. Oh, this is formidable, very daunting. And then we went up a bit more and found that this building was covered in huge planks, like shuttering planks. So all the windows could be protected by huge planks of wood. And I thought, oh, this is good. So we went inside, and of course, so much of the building was covered in windows that with either partly or wholly covered with all this shuttering, wood protection, was very dark indeed. So it was really like going into a big dark castle. And so then the time came to say goodbye to my mother. And then being in this atmosphere of this big dark grey building, all dark, very forbidding indeed. And so my first day at school, starting off with all the happiness and delight in my new suit, new blazer and everything, ended up with, oh, I don't know what to describe it, sadness in the extreme, because then I had to say goodbye to my mother, and I didn't see my blazer or my clothes anymore. I was just given second-hand trousers, grey trousers, and was amongst all the other Reedham boys and girls, missing our mums and wondering what was going to happen next. And so that was a memorable day. in all senses of the word. And I used to remember, not necessarily on that day, but plenty of them besides, Natalie, when once a month our mothers were able to come and visit us for a couple of hours on a Saturday afternoon, once a month. And that was great. But then at 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, again had to say goodbye to our mothers, and the whole process of sadness started again. So having your mother to see you for a couple of hours on visiting day was a bit of a mixed blessing, because it was great to see her, but then you had all the unhappiness of saying goodbye. So anyhow, that was something that became a bit of routine. And I think also that because we were all in the same boat, it sort of brought us together in a way, and that we probably made more friends and deeper friendships amongst ourselves than would otherwise have happened. And that when you are, you know, in trying circumstances, that helps to bond you much more than would otherwise be the case. So there were benefits from these things, and as I said earlier, I've made friends, real lifelong friends, and that if I went just to another day school, chances are that wouldn't have happened. So there were benefits.
How many children were there?
There was something like 130 children. I'm guessing a bit, obviously the roles changed. I think 130, there were 100, there were probably 150, 180 altogether at the school. It may have gone up as much, nearly to 200. I think I'm guessing a bit, at 60, 70, 80 on the boys' side, probably 40 to 50 on the girls' side. Infants, there would probably be 30 odd, 40.
What age,
I'm guessing.
what age group?
Oh, from something almost like 1, from very early date. Yes, some very small children. They took them. I didn't like doing that, but they found that needs must, and some of them went in. In fact, Richard, I think, went in very early age. Yeah, they became part of the Reedham family, and it was special. Not necessarily the best, but it was very special.
Visiting day.
Typical visiting day? Visiting day invariably occurs on a monthly basis. I think it was something like the first Saturday in the month. But I suppose we had something like 3 visiting days in a term, 3 or 4. And the mothers, because I don't recall there being any fathers, because it was ostensibly a school for fatherless children. So the mothers used to arrive something like 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and we'd be ready, and the housemasters would ensure that we were turned out at sufficient standard, and if our shoes weren't cleaned properly, and if our ties weren't tied properly, we wouldn't be allowed to see our mothers. So discipline was never far away from boys and girls at Reedham, including visiting day once a month, and the school expected us to be turned out so that the school was properly represented to the standard that the school believed it should. So fact, if I remember, you wouldn't be allowed to go through to greet your mother or loved one unless you'd sort of been inspected to make sure you were properly dressed and attired. No dirty shoes or anything like that. So that was great. Used to look forward to visiting day, naturally, to see your mum, and vice versa. And even though it was wartime and rations, so you were even rationed for sweets. So you only had a small amount of sweets if you were lucky, depending what period of the war. And so inevitably, the mums used to save up their sweet ration and have some extra for their children, and off we go. Usually with them we'd probably get on the bus from Reedham down on the main road, get on a bus either to Purley Centre, shopping centre at Purley, which was just down the road, like half a mile away, so you would probably walk there and go and have tea in one of the cafes there and tell your mum what you'd been up to, and she would tell you what she was doing. And I suppose those discussions were fairly samey in a way, because life in the war was very mundane, very trying, very worrying, and the meetings, I think, were forged in a mood of great happiness and relief to see your mum again, bearing in mind that life was extremely risky with all the bombs and things falling out of the sky, and so A, to meet them, and B, to see them, that they're all well and hadn't been suffered any effects from the bombs, or something hadn't killed somebody they knew, and things like that. So actually to see them was an extra, what's the word, it was special, because it wasn't certain that these things were actually going to happen. Oh, it's visiting day in a couple of weeks' time, sort of thing, but you couldn't sort of say, I will definitely see my mum there, because there was so much bombing going on that anything could happen. And so when you actually greeted them, it was special. So that was hard, but on the other hand, it was especially good because it wasn't mundane. It wasn't automatic that you were going to see each other. Yeah, that's it. So then there was a department store in Croydon, and they used to put on teas and all sorts of things. You would do in the department store today. Probably they did it a little bit more, shall we say, traditionally, a la the 1930s, where afternoon tea was very much the thing, So to go out to tea was a very happy event. But you see, by the time we got the bus from Reedham down to Croydon, which is about 3 or 4 miles, we had a tram service as well, but the trams started at Purley, so it was better to get the bus closer to the Reedham school building. By the time you got down there, and then you had some tea, say another half an hour, 3/4 of an hour, it was almost time to come back, because visiting hours generally were from 2 till 5 or 6 o'clock. I think they used to make it 6 o'clock in the summer, and restricted it a bit in the winter. So the time soon went. But looking back, visiting days were great because not only did you see your mother or your loved one there, but you knew that the term was going by, so it's another month to the holidays, and so you then looked forward to the holidays. So they were the big attraction. And I suppose, really, moving on to the subject, holidays, I think I talked a little bit about it early, were something which you increasingly were able to benefit from, because the older you got, the more interest that you were able to generate. Did I talk to you about records and things? No. Well, I remember when I think I got to about seven or eight, I came across a broken, slightly battered, wind-up gramophone. Mother hadn't mentioned this to me. I happened to find it in a corner in the living room that she occupied in North Holm Road. And I said, oh, this gramophone. Oh, she said, yes. She said, you've got to be careful with that. So I said, why? Oh, she said, it's, you know, you don't need to break it. So anyhow, after I remember a year or so later, when I was about 7 or 8, she let me use it, and I came across a collection of records. And this was actually wonderful, because I was just old enough to appreciate music and things. And because it was a wind-up one, and found a collection of records, and all 78s obviously, and I really got into playing these records. I used to sit up at the top of the building in North Holm Road with, I think it was mainly my father's collection of records, and I used to sit up there and read books and play these records, and it was really good. And
what kind of music was it?
it was mainly sort of light classical. I mean, one that comes to mind was La Traviata. The two entr'actes, I think, in different sections of the La Traviata, and it was very, very genteel, lovely music, and that a lot of Strauss. Yeah, you used to like the Strauss waltzes and things like that. So coming across this collection of records, A, was novel to me, and B, was very enjoyable. Well, I found that one of the problems was that the stylus on these things were like metal pins you put in. And I thought, oh gosh, these are a bit hard on the vinyl type records. And so I then found out that you could get fibre needles. And so what you did is you filed the ends down, sharpen them up to a point, and then after playing a few more records, they blunt again. So you had to take it out and sharpen it down. But you could buy the fibre, what do you call it? Needles. You could buy them, and so I was much more relaxed about playing the gramophone, knowing that the records wouldn't be wearing out too much because I was on the fibre things. So that was something of great interest during the holidays. So, you know, you play something like La Traviata, my mind goes back to those days. And the same with Strauss. Yeah. And it was actually quite interesting because never remembered my father, and he got pictures. And to think, you see, that's the taste of my father. Those records, those sounds appealed to him. And it was sort of uncanny that most of them appealed to me as well. And there was that sort of link was forged. Mm-hmm. Though I never really knew him as a person. It's fascinating. And you know, I think about music. The qualities of music, I think, are profound and very extensive. It is amazing. I'd like to do a study on music and its effect, certainly to human beings, you know. So it's a thing to work on for the future. So those were happy times, in a funny way, up there in the... Yeah. But as I got older and we were able to meet up with Derek Pierce and Noel, we used to go out together. Life was that much more enjoyable in the school holidays.
Did you get up to any mischief?
Mischief? No, not a lot. I think that at Reedham, or at our time there, with all the time the pressure of the war, the impact of the war, there wasn't a lot of room or time for doing irresponsible things. I think that one was conscious. There was this set of disciplines which abounded, the disciplines that really impacted on the way in which we ran our lives. That, all right, we had jokes and all sorts of things, but for what could be described as deep frivolity and perhaps a bit being naughty, there wasn't so much naughtiness as there probably would be today, where things are much more free and easy. But at the same time, I think because we were, if you like, together suffering these restrictions, we had better friendships, deeper friendships, and we probably got quite a lot out of life. I mean, obviously there wasn't a lot of money, so there weren't a lot of expensive posh toys to have. Hand-me-down toys were very much the thing, and you just made the most of it. And you know, it's like a lot of things in life, if you've never had them, you don't miss them. So we, in our own way, were quite happy. As I think Mo said before, the facility of being able to build friendships meant so much more to one. So no, I don't ever feel a sense of deprivation. No. What I used to see sometimes were families who did have much more money and did have the facility of more toys and things like that, but they never seemed to me to be happier. They're probably more aroused there. No, so I think that we had a much more rounded existence, and we're able to build a fuller life in our school years. And perhaps an interesting comparison was I was fortunate to pass through to the grammar school when I was 11. And then, of course, the Reedham boys, the Reedham contingent, out to the Purley County Grammar School, were a bit separate from the boys from ordinary private homes. And one of the interesting things, I never really got to the bottom of it, was that we were all the Reedham boys were put into one house at the Purley County School. We were all put into what was known as White House. And the housemaster, Tubby Hayes, the housemaster from what he made sure he had all the Reedham boys in his house. I never really got down to the bottom of it, but I think because he lived quite near the school, because the catchment for Purley County covered many miles, Sarneston, quite a few places besides Purley, and I think because he lived near Reedham, he thought, I quite like to keep an eye on the Reedham boys, and also I think he thought that because the Reedham boys were active in their own right, because we played our own games together as Reedham boys, represented Reedham School over and above Purley County, that there might be some scope for Tubby Hayes, the housemaster of White House, to get some talent for the house matches and the house events at the grammar school. You see, so that White House would do better than most of the other houses if he got some talent from another school called Reedham. And so we found ourselves in White House, and that was fun, because he used to come around and say, right, I want 3 of you boys, that's to us Reedham boys, I want you for cricket or something. I'm short of 3 for the house side or something, you see. Anyhow, on one occasion, Tubby Hayes, the housemaster, wanted a couple of people for the rugby 15. And so he said, I said, look at me. He said, no, he said, what I want, he said, is a fullback. He said, we're badly missing a fullback. Well, my good friend, whom I was billeted with in Nottingham, he was much bigger than I am, but doesn't matter. And as far as Tubby Hayes was concerned, he said to Phil Harris, he said, I need you, he said. So he said, what do you want me for? He said, I put you down for the first, the 15 to represent the house, for rugby. House 15. He said, we don't play rugby at Reedham. We only play football, soccer. I don't care, he said. I want you, he said. You're big enough and ugly enough, he said, to be fullback. He said, I don't play rugby. And so that was amusing, because unfortunately I couldn't get to stay behind to see the game in the evening. But my friend Phil Harris distinguished himself, because we had a very weak side in White House at the time, and apparently he had the captain of the first 15 rugby was the only person left before the line. So Phil Harris, the only person, and there was the captain of the first 15 for the school, bearing down on him, and all there was left was straight through the leg. And he performed, as I understand it, a classical tackle, and the captain of the first 15 came down, and that made my friend's career as a rugby player. He was immediately, he hardly played, he was immediately put in the school's second 15, 15 for the second, team, and he went on to great things in the rugby world. But I mean, we used to stand on the touchline, didn't go any near the rugby ball because we were only familiar with the round ball, football. But we were like brothers, Phil Harris and myself, because we were billeted together in Nottingham, and we got up to some tricks there. So we were billeted together for 11 months, and so we were like brothers, as I say. And when he got into the side for the rugby, I was really pleased. I being a different build, interested myself more on the cross-country side, and did quite a lot of cross-country running. I didn't actually run for the house team because we had very good people. We had Gordon Peary and his brother, Gordon Peary was, of course, Olympic runner, so few schools wished to compete with us in cross country.